Alrighty, I am very pleased to welcome our last panel to the stage. I think y'all are in the back there. You can make your way forward. Meera Shekar, Global Lead for Nutrition at the World Bank, Arun Baral, CEO of HarvestPlus, and Simon Bishop, CEO of the Power of Nutrition. Alrighty. Good to see you all. Thanks so much for being here. Simon, I know you're in from out of town. Really appreciate you you coming in. I want to start with the elephant in the room. We had a lively discussion amongst these folks who definitely had some thoughts about the sponsorship of this event. And I want to give them a chance to talk about the role of the private sector and the role of business and what that means when we're talking about sustainable food systems, when we're talking about nutrition. And, you know, this last conversation, we kind of want to bring all of these things together. This is the last formal conversation we'll have for the day. We'll get a chance to catch up after this. But Meera, I'd love to start with you. You know, how do you think about the role of the private sector? And I know, you know, you've been very critical about the role that you would like to see them play. What do they need to be doing better?
Well, you asked the most controversial person to speak first. That's fine.
I did that on purpose.
I know. Well, first and foremost, I really want to thank Devex for being responsive to our concerns. And you reassured us that this event is a Devex event, that sponsors have no say and no sway in what happens and what gets discussed. So thank you. We appreciate that. In terms of the private sector, the role of the private sector, and we're talking here nutrition, in addition to food systems, so going beyond food systems to nutrition. I think we recognize as development workers that the private sector has a role to play, and a big role to play in improving nutrition outcomes. And there's no way that these problems can be solved without a role for the private sector. Fully understand that. Having said that, I think what we've seen is across the world, high child stunting rates that are declining somewhat, but rather slowly, and very rapidly increasing obesity rates. Why do we think that is happening? And what role does the private sector have to play in that in terms of the foods that are produced, marketed, distributed by the private sector? And I can go on for a long time on that one, but I want to ask one question of this audience and everybody else listening on. Which country do you think has the highest per capita consumption of instant noodles? Anyone want to make a guess?
Nigeria.
Indonesia?
Nepal. And 25% of the calories that kids 12 to 23 months of age consume in Nepal come from processed, ultra-processed foods and sugar-sweetened beverages. It comes as shocking news to many people. And if you look at the highest consumers, up to 50% of their calories come from these kinds of foods. Now, some people will say that consumers are shaping the market and producers produce what consumers want. But did any of us want an iPhone before we knew what it was? Today, we can't live without it. I have withdrawal symptoms if I put it aside too far. So producers and corporations have a huge role to play in shaping the market. And that's my big plea to all the private sector. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Simon, what are your thoughts on that, and particularly that piece of, you know, the role that consumers can play?
I mean, clearly critical, right? Absolutely critical, and particularly if we just need to get people talking about healthy diets and eating healthy. I was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi 2 weeks ago, and it was actually amazing to see the drive for healthy diet, and it was healthy food was widely available, and it was backed by the government, it was backed by the private sector, and you could just see it everywhere. And I think, interestingly, in that case, it was driven by partly there's just like a deep, visceral, they'll never grow enough food for themselves in the region. So food insecurity is deep. Right. It runs deep. And therefore, they really want to sort this out. So I think that's important. I mean, just broadening things out. I mean, I share Meera's concerns. I also recognize the private sector has to be part of the solution, right? We're not going to achieve zero hunger. We're not going to achieve any of the global goals without the private sector. Unilever, a partner of ours, reaches 2 billion people every day with its products, not all food, some soap and other things. But, that illustrates the scale. And we heard from PepsiCo, CD Glynn, I think, I hope that's the right name. And by the way, I hope you probably guess where from out of town I've come from. But, it absolutely plays a critical role. And so it is about collaborating. It's about asking tough questions too, and ensuring that particularly these big companies that reach so many people are responsible corporate citizens.
Arun, I want to hear from you on this too.
Yeah, I agree with Simon, Meera. I come from the private sector. I'm new to development. But, I mean, I come from ag background, and, in the pursuit of profit, now that I work on the nutrition side, and I tell people, the private sector bred out nutrition in the crops, right? It was yield, yield, and yield. And now when I sit on this side and I scratch my head and I say, my God, what we did. I mean, I spent 30 years of my life there. So it's a question of educating the private sector. It's very important. I think it's a question how we do that. We need to collaborate with the private sector. They're part of the solution, by the way, because ultimately things have to be sustainable. Development has a lifespan, and then projects end, and what happens, right? So, we talk about commitments, and I think private sector, Pepsi and others should stand up and make some solid commitments to nutrition. So, some examples, how much, your product portfolio, how much of that product portfolio, to Charles' point on stunting, can be converted into healthy foods that has high level of zinc and iron and those kinds of things that when kids eat, some things are addressed just as a snack every day. Similarly, for companies in agriculture, if I were to go back to private sector, and if I ever happen to be a CEO, I would make a commitment, especially for people like who are in the seed sector, that I will make a commitment to ensure that the seed varieties that I release, the new next generation of crops, they have better nutrition than the previous ones. And I would put out some metrics, benchmarks, and make sure that, yield is not compromised, but then nutrition is not either. So these are very practical examples, and, healthy foods are profitable. The organization I work for, HarvestPlus, has come up with, crops that are high in zinc and iron and vitamin A. And, we're interacting with the private sector, and especially the small and the medium and the micros. And they're making very healthy foods out of these crops. Now, these are staple crops. They'll always be on your dinner plate. You can't replace them. But you can replace them with a healthier variety of the same, crops. So be it pearl millet or millets, be it sorghum, be it maize. So, these are some of the real, actionable items that, private sector, public sector, civil societies, all can do to make this a more healthy and nutritious, we talk about systems, food systems.
Right.
So I'll stop here. Maybe I've gone a little overboard, but I just wanted to give some good examples of what is possible and what we should strive for.
Simon, do you want to add something?
It's fine. He's nailed it.
Okay. Great. I'd love to move on and talk a little bit about the financing piece for nutrition. We've talked a little bit about so far in our previous panels about financing for the food system. Meera, you were super involved in Nutrition for Growth, and that event, which was originally supposed to be held in 2020, got bumped a year by 2021, still had to be held mostly virtually, but sort of was a time of momentum. How are you feeling about that right now, given what's happening in Ukraine, constrained fiscal space that remains after COVID? Are you still hopeful that that momentum can continue?
Well, nobody prepares for a crisis, unfortunately, and we didn't either. I think N4G, or Nutrition for Growth, was a huge success, despite all the challenges at that time, and despite the fact that it was a virtual event postponed by 2 years. We got, or the government of Japan that hosted it, got commitments of nearly $30 billion, which is huge. Now, of course, some of that is not new monies, but hopefully a lot of it is new money. And we have put in place an accountability framework, so that those commitments that were made are being registered and will be followed over time to see what comes to fruition and what does not. Having said that, certainly COVID and then the Ukraine crisis have constrained fiscal space among donor countries. So we anticipate there will be pullback on the ODA. That will happen, and we're already hearing that from many countries. At the same time, client countries or low middle income countries are also struggling under these fiscal constraints. So we have to be cognizant of those. Nobody planned for this. Nobody wanted this to happen, but it is a reality. So I suspect that there will be constraints in that. How can we expand on the fiscal space? Certainly, and I know Simon will talk about that, matching. I work at the World Bank, and so our MO is really to give credit to countries so that they can scale up large-scale programs. But when we partner those with grants of the kind that I know Simon will talk about, so I don't want to steal his thunder, that really helps countries to request for credit for what is considered soft sectors like nutrition. So that's one way to deal with the issues. The other way, and again, I'm not sure this will be particularly popular with the private sector, but we've been having conversations with a lot of country governments around fiscal policies around unhealthy foods. So is it taxation on unhealthy foods? I think, if I remember correctly, 47 plus countries have taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages at the moment, and we anticipate that will grow. Similar conversations happening around other unhealthy foods as well. How do we support these countries to make this happen? How do we design those taxes in a way that they can be they can achieve the purpose of improving health, nutrition outcomes? But there's another positive, what my economist friends call positive externality, which is it also increases fiscal space in the country. Sometimes those monies are earmarked for improving health, nutrition outcomes, but sometimes they're not. And I think of course, governments decide what they want to do with that, but that is certainly a way to increase fiscal space within the countries. It's not popular, particularly among the private sector, but that's certainly one way to do it. But we've also learned that taxes alone will not solve the problem. We need to bundle it with marketing regulations, labeling, and the like. There's a whole bundle of things that can be done. And I think we should collectively talk about how we address these issues.
Simon, bring on your thunder.
Thank you. I think to start with, there's a language piece here. It's a food and nutrition security crisis, not a food crisis, and we need to recognize that you won't solve this just by getting calories into bodies. we know you need the nutrition to have healthy bodies. So there's an important language piece in all of this. Secondly, and I used to be a political advisor. Sorry about that, it's dodgy spin doctor. But there is there's a political angle to leverage here because this issue, food and nutrition price rises is universal. And politicians don't like inflation because it makes them very unpopular, and they don't like it when their voters can see it. And I think you can all see it here in DC. Everyone's moaning about the weekly shop going up. I see it in London. And we've seen, I think probably more so in Europe than here, governments running around on the energy security side, desperately trying to secure new renewables energy, maybe nuclear. And so we've seen that on the energy side already, less so on the food side, but I think it will come because rich countries also source their food supply from the likes of Ukraine. So there's a political moment here, an opportunity to leverage. And sadly, we know that issues that affect rich countries and poor countries get more attention than when it's just an issue that affects poor countries. That's a very sad reality of life. So I think there's an opportunity there. There's also, and thank you, Meera, for teeing me up, smart use of grant. So, Meera was talking to the government of Madagascar, and they were looking at taking out a $40 million IDA loan for nutrition. We came along with 10 million of grant that we'd raised from donors and said, we'll put this in, but only if you double the IDA loan and if you spend a chunk of the grant, making the whole 90 a better program. And we've actually seen in another one of our programs where they were diverting funding away to COVID instead of core health system strengthening, we managed to protect the nutrition funding because of our grant element. Finally, and I hope you don't mind one shameless pitch, we have a funder who's willing to match pound for pound, dollar for dollar, up to $20 million for cash transfers programs in response to Ukraine-related food insecurity, but we have to find a match. So I'm just looking at Pepsi, CD, Glenn sitting there in the audience, or any other private sector. It doesn't have to be private sector, it could be any other philanthropists out there. But if you fancy doubling your money, and we can use some of that potentially again to leverage even more out of World Bank IDA, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
I want to pick up on what you said about at the very beginning, the language that we use. Arun, why does nutrition constantly get left out of this? Why do we say food security and nutrition just doesn't make it into the headlines?
That's a great question. I don't know why. I mean, frankly, nutrition should be front and center. Again, going back to Charles and stunting, I think it's baffling why nutrition is being left out, because food is supposed to be nutritious. Bottom line. And it has a intergenerational impact, right? I mean, for generations, if you're malnourished, I mean, you're going to pay a huge price. So it baffles me. I mean, Teresa, what needs to happen, I think, is these dialogues around nutrition. I think we need to elevate nutrition as much as we do food security. That's not happening. There is a CEO council here in DC, which I'm a member of, which I think, Simon, you're a member of as well, or not yet, soon to be. But, we need to engage policymakers, the Hill, and elevate the conversation. Because unless we elevate the conversation, food security is always going to win. The sad thing is, hunger is very visible. Like you show the pictures and, my God, you pull out your wallet and do whatever you can. Unfortunately, nutrition is not visible. But the impact is like as devastating or even more because, it is intergenerational. I mean, so I think the answer is, how can we do that is elevate it up, dialogues and solid commitments by the nutrition community to take this forward. Do you want to add anything, Meera?
Yeah, I guess I would add, let me first say, at the World Bank, we have changed the language. We talk about food and nutrition security in one thing. And it's been a long road, but we are there at the moment. Having said that, why is it that nutrition doesn't show up? I think there are multiple reasons. For food, there is a Ministry of Agriculture. For health, there is a Ministry of Health. For nutrition, it just kind of falls in between the cracks of the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Social Protection. There's some little thing in the Ministry of Education. It just falls through the cracks. Do we want a Ministry of Nutrition? I don't think so. I don't think that's the solution, but that is the problem. And we need to resolve it, perhaps thinking about things like the way HIV/AIDS was tackled, where there was no Ministry of HIV/AIDS, but we needed multiple ministries to play their role. And many governments set up these TAC AIDS and AIDS councils and the like, calling them by different names. But these were councils or groups that had authority under either the prime minister or the president or somebody who is able to bring ministries together, have the authority and the financing in order to help solve the problem. So I think that's the direction we need to push in terms of institutional arrangements to make these things happen.
And do you think that there is the capacity for that right now, given the layers of crisis that we're in?
You have to create capacities. You have to create opportunities. I think, the development space is very, very crowded at the moment. And I've never seen in my decades of development work a time when the development space is not crowded with other agendas. So we've just got to push our way through and show examples of countries that have done it. Look at a country like Senegal that actually put together a group called the CLM at that time. It's in French, so don't ask me to translate that. But it was a group that was well managed, empowered. When you go to visit the CLM office, you press the elevator button, it takes you straight to the 11th floor, which is the Prime Minister's office. They had access, they had resources, they got some financing from the bank, but they used it really well. And it's the only country in Africa that actually met the MDG goals on nutrition. So is it possible? Absolutely, it's possible. We all collectively need to do much more on that, on building the right kinds of institutions and governance arrangements in country to be able to address this very complex issue.
You want to add something?
Just a couple of things to add to that. I mean, and we do this, and we try. We've got to keep banging the drum about how foundational nutrition is. So, there's no point cutting the nutrition budget and then keeping the education budget, right? Because we know that if a kid doesn't get the right nutrition the first 1,000 days, they'll turn up at the first day of school and they'll be mentally impaired. So it's a false choice. So I think we've got to keep making that case. And so you actually get, better ROI on your dollar of education spend if you keep the nutrition going. So it's not a zero-sum game. I also think, whilst it's not a complete solution, pointing out to the private sector the cost of poor nutrition is really important. And we've got some great new research coming out soon that literally points out it costs the private sector billions of dollars because they basically have stunted kids, kids that are too short for their age. Madagascar, again, 43%. That goes into their workforce. They're less productive. That's less profits. That's less economic
massive
growth.
Human capital issue.
It's a huge, and what's great about this new research is you can cut it by 110 countries and by sectors like the garment sector, the manufacturing sector. So we're hoping to be able to use that to target specific sectors in specific countries and say, you need to do more on this subject or on this issue. And hopefully that will be very effective at getting more private sector engagement into this area.
And I was going to say, do you think that will be effective to sort of call people out, essentially?
Like I said at the start, it's always good. You can name and shame. You can throw rocks on the outside. I like to be on the inside. Dialogue, cajoling, nudging, incentivizing, pointing out the data, and then they get there themselves. That's sort of how I think it's better to operate. I think it's worth saying this is not a short-term fix to the kind of food and nutrition security crisis we are about to see. It's probably a bit of a longer one, but nevertheless, it's a really important element of sustainable solution to all of this.
And Arun or Meera, sorry, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just to add briefly to that, I think with the private sector, we need to give them what we call the whiffing principle. What's in it for me? Show them what is it in it for them. And if you can show them, as Simon was saying, with this new paper that is going to, I think it may have already been released, or
It's just been released, but we haven't gone big on the promotion.
Okay. I didn't want to jump the gun. To show them that they are losing productivity, the private sector, that they will have less productive workers, and that will hit their bottom line. I think that's the argument we need to push. And then on the, I can't miss the obesity side because it's my new, because we've seen rapid increases in obesity in every single region in the world. And the costs, healthcare costs associated with those. And the World Obesity Federation put out a paper just earlier this year, or was it early last year, end of last year, that showed that obesity costs the world about 1.8% of GDP in 2019.
Wow.
1.8% of GDP.
That's a lot.
And if we don't do anything about it, by 2016, it will be 3.6%. So it will double. We need to address this issue, and not just for the public sector's sake, not just for the global public good, but also for the private good of the private sector. And I'm appealing to the private sector with that thing. Sorry. Yeah.
Arun, did you want to add something on that?
No, not really. Just that what Meera said, there's money to be made here. And I don't know why private sector is missing out on this opportunity. I just, I'm coming from there. If I were to ever go back, there's tons of money to be made here. So
send you back.
Yeah, I'm ready. Because if we can help from the other side, why not?
Wanted to ask you, we haven't really chatted about Ukraine directly yet, but what are you concerned about? Obviously, HarvestPlus does a lot of work with, fortified crops and agriculture. What are you concerned about, the impacts that Ukraine is going to have on your work and food and nutrition security?
Yeah, so a great question. So, before we had COVID, we had about 3 billion people who could not afford a healthy diet. So, just that statement should be jarring, right? We're 7 billion, 3 billion can't. So that's a shocker. Then came COVID, another 100 million got pushed, give or take, into poverty. And when you're poor, obviously healthy diets, affordability is a problem. And now this is the Ukraine crisis is creating severe shocks on prices, global commodities, etc., and severe disruption to global systems like food, fertilizer, energy. So the state of hunger and nutrition is going to get worse. So that's a big concern. Women and children are going to take a disproportionate hit. That's a concern. And again, I go back to Charles, I go back to Simon talking about the intergenerational impact. All the kids are going to be born now in the low and middle countries and poor families. See what's going to happen to them. And that's our future, right? That's the future of those countries. So future is being impaired. So that's a concern. And then, Meera talked about $30 billion and 4G commitments. I hope we can, keep that in that space. That's a concern because, the crisis in Ukraine is heartbreaking. It shouldn't. In 21st century, there should be no wars. But, look at what's happening. And then, the governments in the low and middle income countries, they are resource constrained, right? And then whatever they have allocated to nutrition budgets, I hope that can stay. And it's the sort of collective responsibility of all developed nations to sort of help the low and middle income countries sort of keep that allocation. Because if not, then there is, for the next many years, we're going to have a real health crisis in the making.
I want to ask you a little bit about partnerships. You sort of alluded to that in the financing space, and a potential partnership that you have, in this particular moment. But how does Power of Nutrition think about partnerships, and why is that key to really galvanizing and financing in this space?
At its heart, it's impact, right? How do you drive the largest amount of impact? And of course, that's why most of us in the room are watching Get Out of Bed every day, is to make the biggest impact possible. And that's what gets me excited about, the Power of Nutrition and its model, that it can be extremely impactful because it has smart partnerships and matches those with smart financial models. So in a nutshell, we raise $1 from a donor. The British government or the Children's Investment Fund match it. We then ask our wonderful implementing partners, UNICEF, World Bank, big NGOs, World Food Programme, to also match it. So then you've got $4 and you've got some wonderful partners coming together. And you can use that then, because you've got that financial heft, to deliver government-owned nutrition programs at scale and use some of that grant to make sure it's best practice. So you're not only helping plug the enormous financing gap, you're also, sorry to borrow your catchphrase, Meera, getting more nutrition for the money. So it's a terrible term, win-win, but you're helping plug the gap, and you're getting more nutrition in terms of the quality and the impact. And we've sort of reached 92 million people now, and will help with our wonderful partners prevent 600,000 cases of stunting by the end of this year, which is sort of 2 years earlier than our target. So it's by smart partnerships and smart financial models together, you can really make a big difference.
And are you confident that all of that will be able to continue and sort of withstand this latest shock?
You never know in these things, right? But as the point I was sort of making, in a way, this just makes all of our work and the work of the nutrition sector even more relevant. And the great thing is, and we heard someone say this earlier on, the number of, it's a silver lining to the very dark COVID cloud. Those cash transfers, those social protection systems have actually come on leaps and bounds because of COVID, and that's going to be at the heart of mitigating the impact of Ukraine. Right, we can now target very effectively the most vulnerable families, the single parent households, the pregnant women, the families who've just had a baby, and target them very quickly with cash transfers. And I think that's incredibly powerful, and will be at the heart of this. So you can, you keep trying to be positive rather than negative, and this is actually a positive, right? We can actually mitigate the impact of this very quickly and in a very cost efficient, smart way, and that's actually quite exciting.
And Meera, on the bank side, obviously a lot of mobilization is happening. We just had the meetings last week, and lots of things centered around Ukraine, given the impact on, as we've discussed here, food, fuel, fertilizer. How quickly can the bank get this money out the door and hopefully prevent the worst of a nutrition crisis on top of the one that we're already experiencing?
I wish I could really answer that question. No, seriously, the bank is actually working extremely hard. I'm not able to speak to some of the discussions that we're having in-house, but there is a lot of conversation on how we develop programs. Usually we take a year to develop a national program. And that's part of the work that the bank does on the fiduciary side, on the procurement side, on the legal side. All that needs to be done. Make sure every T is crossed and every I is dotted before we release the monies, because we are the guardians of those resources. But we are trying to develop what we refer to as crisis response windows and fast track initiatives that will hopefully be able to move much faster than has been the case till now. In fact, under the CRW, the crisis response window, we have already in the last year or so, I can't remember the exact amounts, but a fairly large, I want to say, and don't quote me on this, but I think something close to $500 million have already been allocated to countries for that purpose. But of course, it also depends on the absorption capacity at the other end. And that's
Right.
where the earlier issue that you mentioned around building capacities is absolutely critical. We've all seen that countries that don't have strong health systems, for example, are not able to utilize even the vaccines that they have available. So you've got to do these things really carefully. And I just want to reiterate what Simon and Arun said earlier about how the first 1,000 days of a child's life are so critical in terms of building a child's brain capacity. And if you miss the 1,000-day window, it's a window of opportunity. If you miss it, you really have lost a whole generation in terms of future productivity, educability, and human capital. And you've heard a lot from the bank about human capital. There's another event on tomorrow morning as well on human capital. So it really is critical. And lastly, learning from the COVID crisis, we've seen that individuals who are obese were 48% more likely to die of COVID-related cases than normal ones, 114% more likely to be hospitalized, and 74% more likely to be in the ICU. These numbers are ingrained in my head for, you think we should have prevented this in terms of, if we had some longer term thinking in terms of crisis preparedness, we should be doing much more on this. Let me stop there.
We've got just 1 minute left. Simon, I can see you've got a final thought.
Well, I just want to say, look, we've got to all keep shouting from the rooftops about all of this, but there are some, green shoots. Really encouraging to see the 170 billion announcement by the World Bank last week. Really encouraging to see the joint statement between the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. We've got to keep trade going. We don't want countries hoarding their food. Joint statement as well with WFP and other humanitarian actors, because we've got to sort that out as well. So there's green shoots of coordination in the international system, which I think is very welcome. Although, we still have a very long way to go.
All righty. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much, all of you. Great having this discussion. I think this was a great way to end the day. Some calls to action there, which I think are always good to end on. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.